Stream on Melody Drive. I am your host, Paul Lane. Guys, I'm just so grateful that you've taken time to spend some time with us this morning. I hope life is going well for you. You know, we got a lot of things going on in politics. We got a lot of things going on in the world. The solar winds have picked up to 600 kilometers per second today, which was, I don't know what that means, but it's pretty nasty. Stay out of the sun if you can. We got a beautiful weekend ahead. And again, you're watching KUHS, the stream on Melody Drive, and this is the Boost, the Weekend Boost. I'm your host, Paul Lane, and the author of The Caregiver's Handbook, a self-help love story. And Charlene, I'm going to give this copy of this book to you today.
Thank you.
My guest today, as I'm so excited, as you all know, I'm a big supporter of CALMA, the Colorado Alliance for Latino Latino authors, mentors and authors. And I'm not firing on all cylinders today. No. But yeah, I went to a CALMA event here a couple of weeks ago, guys. I encourage you, find out about CALMA, C-A-L-M-A, join it, become a mentor. If you're interested in becoming an author, those of you who follow the show, CALMA is a great resource, and I love the energy that I get when I come there, and the people I meet. And Charlene was there just last week or a couple of weeks ago, and promoting her book, and we're going to be talking about her book today. So, guys, throughout the show, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, I'm going to see if Henry can let us know. But we're going to go ahead and get started. I am just so excited to have Charlene on the show today. Her book was so fascinating to me because I'm from Southern Colorado. I'm from from Walsenburg, which is just north of San Luis, the San Luis Valley. And Charlene actually came from there. She wrote this book called Orphan Stock, and it goes growing up adopted in a manito culture. So those of you who are Latino, Chicano, you know the term manito. I know I've heard it all my life. And so you grew up as a manito in Southern Colorado.
Yeah, I grew up as a manita, and it's the only place that I really have heard that phrase. My great grandma, who was born in the 1880s, she used to say "somos manitos," and what that meant is that our ancestors arrived in New Mexico since 1598 with Oñate. And and then in 1680 there was an Indian revolt, and they were pushed back to El Paso. But in 1692 they came back with the Vargas, and they were there to stay. And they migrated, into Española, Taos, and then into the San Luis Valley. And they were very isolated for about 300 years. So we even kept the language, the Castilian language. We speak a special language, the old language. When I went to Spain, they wanted to know what century I was from.
Wow.
Because I was using phrases that were like hundreds
archaic.
Archaic. And so that's who we manitos are. You have that self-identification. Are you Hispanic, Chicano, whatever? Well, I'm a manita. My family arrived in the United States in 1598, and they've been here for that long. And I'm a genealogist, so I know the history, and I know all my grandpas and grandmas way back. I think it's 15 generations that I've done.
Oh my goodness, that's wonderful.
Yeah. So, but in the Hispanic culture, or whatever you want to call yourself, children were given away, for different reasons. There were too many in the family. Maybe a relative couldn't have children. The mother died and the father couldn't take care of them, so they gave them away to another family. And I was given away to my Aunt Irma, my real dad's sister. We went to Pueblo, where my dad was working in the mill, and I couldn't take the heat in Pueblo, and I was becoming dehydrated. So my Aunt Irma took me. She had no children. Her and Gilbert raised me.
And you were just 9 months old.
Yeah, 9 months old. And my grandma's the one that insisted that I be given away, because grandmas were real instrumental. And so I was, and I grew up in this wonderful family. People think, well, wasn't that weird? Because my family eventually ended up moving back to Garcia, and I was only a mile away from them. And people think it's kind of weird, but hey, I'm still sane. I didn't, it was such a wonderful place. I grew up in Garcia, Colorado, right on the border of Colorado and New Mexico, 20 miles from San Luis, and it was such a wonderful place to grow up in, because I know all the old ways. All my cousins were moving to Denver and so on. So basically, my book is about growing up that way, and all the people that lived in the village, and just really interesting characters.
Mhm.
And like I said, the language, my first language was Spanish, and it was Castilian. And so I'm so happy that that was my first language, because I would hate not to know Spanish today, because it was taken away from us, our language.
Yes, it was, we're gonna talk about that later in the show, and it really was, and I talk about the internalization of inferior status, and it was not a status we placed on ourselves, but it was a societal expectation or an inferiority that was really pounded into us as from childhood on. No Spanish, no cultural, you can't do your cultural things, you can't do the things that are your familial values, and so we were really forced into assimilation in many ways.
We were, if you went to school and your name was Juan, it was changed to John, you know, or Maria was changed to Mary, and so we lost our own identity, you know, as little children. In the valley, and some of the schools we were able to keep that. We weren't subjected to that, but I know a lot of my cousins that moved to Denver came back with, you know, different names, you know, and
I'm Manny. I know. I see so many men named Manny, and I say, I think about when you were a child and your real name was Manuel.
Yeah, I know. And if you were Carlos, you know, Charles. You know, so we had to get used to our cousins having new names when they went back to the valley. And it's the teachers who changed them. You know, and so that's really sad. Really sad.
I'm curious. Have you ever heard the term chilero?
To me, it refers to somebody that picks chili. You know, that picks chili. That they used to have like trucks that the patron, or not the patron, but the mayordomo would pick people up, and then they would go pick chile. And if you did that, you were chilero.
Okay, yeah, so when I was growing up, I heard those two terms, and I knew I was a manito. Well, I was from the manitos, and, you know, there were some people who were chileros, and they were, and I never knew really what the difference was. I thought they were the same.
Yeah, no, actually there was a train called Chili Line, and I think it went like from Antonito to Española, you know, it was a Chili Line, and I don't know why it was named Chili Line, but I always remember that. And so, yeah, if you're a chilero, you know, pick chili, and, you know, and you work the farms.
Very cool. I think, you know, as I read your book, oh my gosh, it's so fascinating. I mean, I've read through and I'm highlighting page after page after page, because, you know, I think for me, and I only speak for me, but growing up, it seems like our family just showed up on the face of the earth. You know, for many years, we didn't know anyone past my great-grandparents. You know, I knew that my great-grandmother was Apache, you know, and my grandfather was a Navajo. And I knew that their parents, you know, a little bit about them. And years later, we had some family who did some genealogy, and we went back to, you know, the 1500s and when they came from Spain. And so it was really, really so incredibly awesome to read your book, and it was like so revelatory. I think about the book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and how so much of our cultural history was buried not in books, because it was never written down until Dee Brown came and put it on paper. And your book is so revealing, because there's so much that happened before our grandparents were here, and that we were conquered twice in that area. Literally, I mean, there was a conquest, and then they went, the Spaniards went away, they came back and reconquered it.
I know, they came back like bad pennies.
Back like bad pennies. Yeah, I know. When you talk about how the locals were just so disappointed when they saw them come back, and how terrible it must be, you know, to be, well,
they had the weapons, you know, they had the guns, and, you know, so they, you know, that's how they did it. But we, I grew up as Spanish American, pure Spanish American. All, you know, all us in the valley I don't know what they thought, that the boat dock on the Rio Grande. We never, ever knew our history. The only thing that we really, the 3 C's, Columbus, Cortez, and Coronado, that's all.
Wow.
15, and it stopped at 1540, like nothing happened between 1540 and 1848, or with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So we were pure Spanish American, and it was really, we didn't want to call ourselves Mexican, because that was kind of almost a derogatory.
That was an insult.
Yeah, and we certainly had no Indian blood in us. Oh my God, that would have been terrible, because we used to go to the Taos Pueblo, and these poor Indians, we'd see them in blankets and this, just, you know, in poverty, and you didn't want to identify with them. And then here comes, you know, the 21st century, and we take our DNA, and we're 30% indigenous.
Yes,
And,
yes.
and that's really sad that we were made to not know our history and then be ashamed of who we really
Yep.
were.
And again, that term internalization of inferior status was so impactful on our ancestors that they didn't even know it, but it was so deeply ingrained that they, I don't want to say forced it on us, but they indoctrinated us to believe that we were down here. I remember my mom saying, "Don't you ever call yourself a Chicano." It was during the Corky Gonzalez movement, and she says, "If you walk out of school, I'm going to beat your ass." But you know what? I was ignorant, and I didn't know what that movement was about, the crusade for justice, and it was really about equality. And my mom was convinced that it was not. She was convinced that Chicano was a bad term, like Mexican or like Indian, like Indio. And we were convinced that we were down here instead of really who we really are, And so when I read through your book and I start seeing about these little trends or these things that happen, it just almost completes me. It makes me whole. It's almost like there was this piece over here and it fit right in. And so I just wanted to point that out. I loved your book. I really do.
Thank you. Yeah, when I started at Upstate College, that's the first time I heard the word Chicano and the Chicano movement, and I wanted nothing, to do with those people because they were militant. They were, they were militant, and and I didn't understand. And they told me my Spanish ancestors were bad people, and I said, well, my grandma and grandpa weren't bad people. So it took me a few years to really find out what the Chicano movement was about. It really did, and it was in the town of La Junta where the first time I met super racism. And they didn't care if I was Mexican, Spanish, whatever I called myself. I was, actually they totally labeled me Mexican. Totally labeled me, and then dirty, of course, that phrase. And this is when I was working for the railroad. So, when I worked for the railroad, I chose to work in the maintenance of way department, and this was with the men that built the track, and the rail and everything. And then of course they were the Hispanic, Mexican, Chicano, whatever they were calling themselves. And I really liked to work with them because this man turned in an insurance claim for having gone to see a curandera. Oh my God, the whole office force was laughing, almost rolling over. They couldn't, and I stood up. That's the first time I stood up. And I said, hey, this is serious. Sometimes a curandera for Hispanic people is better than a
Way
doctor.
Better.
And they never did pay the claim, of course. The insurance, wouldn't understand. But when Diana Velasquez, a curandera, was here in Denver, I remember she worked with Ramon del Castillo, and he got her to work in the clinic, and the insurances started paying the claims because they understood that she could help these people with whatever methods she used.
It is so weird that you mentioned Ramon del Castillo because I was thinking about him when you were talking about that. Because he and I had talked about curanderos, and he's been trained by some, and he's had some curandero influence.
I think one of his theses is on curanderismo. I can't remember, but Ramon is an amazing man.
Yes, and you mentioned in your book Lalo Delgado.
Lalo.
And I got to meet him once back in the 90s, and I had no grasp of who Lalo Delgado was.
Oh my God, Lalo just had to come into the room, and he would open his mouth, and his poetry would zoom. My daughter worked with him at Escuela Tlatelolco on and then they did kind of a lesson plan together. Lalo was one of the most wonderful people, poet, and like I said, he just resonated.
Yes, he just had I remember him coming into our room, and we were in the Visiones Leadership Training Program over at UCD, and Paulie Baca, brought him in, and I just remember listening to him, and it's like, man, I could listen to him forever. He was, I don't know, he was mesmerizing. His words were so powerful, and so it did impact me greatly.
Yes, To Stupid America is still being taught in Chicano literature, and that was one of his first big poems. And I just saw Polly a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, cool.
At the Genealogy Society meeting. So she's an amazing woman also.
Oh yes, first Hispanic legislator in Northern Colorado, from Greeley, Colorado. And
so many things.
So really, what I gather really from your book is that there are heroes all around us, and I'm kind of just kind of a view, a perspective, I guess. And there are heroes all around us, and we really don't realize the magnitude of the energy that's within us and around us. And when we walk into a room of people, it's really, I think, beneficial if we humble ourselves and look around. Like, I think that this work is going to go down in history. I really believe that the information that you've gathered here, that you've collected, and that you put forth is for me, it was very impactful.
Well, thank you.
And I thought to myself, man, this is legendary works, man. I mean, this is not just a memoir. This is so many people don't know anything about the Manito culture. I remember years ago we had a relative who was a criado, and the story was that when he got married, that his adopted parents gave him a team of mules and sent him on his way. And I was always under the impression that the word criado meant servant, and because that's what he was to that family, and so it's so interesting that that's not the meaning of it.
Well, it is. The criado used to be called the genizados. The genizados, which is a new term, were the indigenous people that were brought into the Spanish household, by force, more than likely, and they were required to work a whole generation for them. So it is a servant. It is
Wow.
it is a servant, but also I don't know why the word criado was used for children that were raised by other people than their parents. So it does have.
So it does have a dual meaning.
It does have the genizado, which now we call genizados. Those are the people that were, indigenous servants, or you don't want to use the word slave, but really they were brought into the Spanish households and worked for them. They were required to be there for at least one generation. So
Wow.
it is a dual, because some people tell me, I never heard criado, and this is another thing. The only time they really use criado is probably Albuquerque north to the San Luis Valley, because you don't hear that either.
So there's another term that's isolated, manito.
And criado, and it's Ruben Cabos, I think, is the one that wrote a book about the Castilian Spanish, and then all the other languages that come in there, the
Arabian,
Aztec, the Arab, even the Jewish, the Latino, which is Sephardic Jew.
Yeah. When I was reading about the Sephardic Jews that came with these parties, they're like, wow.
Like Abuja is Ladino, which is Sephardic Jew, and Abuja is a needle. Zacate is Aztec or Soquete, and I always thought it was Spanish, but it really stems from. Yeah, and then Alberjon, all the ALs are Moorish. We have all this mixture.
Yeah.
And then we have, of course, chale or chante, which comes from the gypsies that came over.
Yeah.
So there's this big, the language is so interesting because it comes from.
It's been influenced by
so many places. But
and Arab too, and the Moors, yeah.
Yeah, and like I said, Alberjon is peas, the wheat, and yeah, it's really interesting. The language itself is so fascinating.
Wow.
It really is.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it because there's so many questions that you have, and we're going to talk a little while later about Olibama Lopez Tushad, but I met her back in the early 90s, and she was much young, she was alive then, but she wrote this book, The People of El Valle, and she told me about the unique culture in the San Luis Valley, and I was so blessed. I didn't know it at the time, but I was able to hear it directly from her mouth, about the culture and about the language, the marriage customs, the food, every bit of the dialect. I mean, all of our value systems, family values, was all unique in all of the world. And I think for the first time when I met her was the first time I held my head up and said, man, I am special, man. I am really of royalty. I'm not going to let anybody convince me otherwise, the other thing that I have to say was all my life growing up, I was always, I guess, labeled an angry young man. And recently I watched John Leguizamo's Latino History for Morons. Everybody, you need to see this on Netflix. But I saw that and I understood this internalization of inferior status, how it was pounded into us, and every time we would try to get up, we were put back down, and
they needed the labor.
Yeah. I don't remember, it was a Secretary of Labor in an office previous who said oh, the Hispanic people are great. You know, the same thing Columbus says. They're very friendly. They're very generous. They're very hardworking. They make great slaves.
That's true.
And you know, I mean, we chuckle about it, but the sad thing about it is it was a real statement, and we're sad that there's people out there today who think the same thing of us. And so there's a part of me that still is an angry man, but it's not it's a different anger. It's a harnessed anger. It's an anger that's used for benefit, for opening people's eyes, for revealing truths that have been hidden from us. I don't want to get radical or anything, but the truth of the matter is that we have been convinced that we are less than.
Yeah, there's a man named James, I think it's James Lowe Evan. He wrote a book called Lies My History Teacher Told Me.
Oh.
Taught me. It's something like that. The title's something like, and it just opens your eyes about,
man.
We were seeing, well, we weren't taught our history, first of all, and if ever there was any, mention of somebody like us, it was derogatory.
Mm-hmm.
And then the commercials, the Frito Bandito,
Yes.
how
the
we were
negative
perceived.
stereotypes.
Yeah, the negative stereotypes. So, when my generation, when we went to college, we were made to feel ashamed of it. So we tried to, become part of the mainstream until we found out the truth. If the truth was taught, there's so much pride to be taken in our history and in our culture and in our traditions. And so I'm so happy to be who I am.
Yes, I love who I am. I mean, I think about and I'm just going to say this, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, and how he must hate that face he sees in the mirror, because he hates his blackness so much that he will attack people and do things that are going to harm people who are less than in societal norms or societal perspectives, and I'm really saddened by that. I grew up hearing, the term. My mom always said, I'm Spanish, I'm Spanish, and I used to get so mad at that, because I said, don't you know the Spaniards and, King Philip, he oppressed us, and he authorized slavery, and he came and they raped our mothers and our grandmothers, and the angry man came out in me. And I would refuse to claim the Spanish blood. However, how can I refuse? How can I deny who I really am? And so, like you say, I am Gypsy, I'm Sephardic Jew, I'm Arab, I'm Spaniard, I'm European, and I'm indigenous.
Yeah. Well, like in Corky Gonzalez's poem, I Am Joaquin, he says we are both.
Yes.
We are the conquered, and we are,
and so are, yes,
the rulers.
Oh, what? That's so beautifully put.
So we have that, that confusion. And then if you're not taught your history, you don't understand it, you're going to stay confused. You're going to stay an angry man.
Yes, and you're always in this bubble, and you always pigeonholed, and people are always stigmatizing you, and it's a very sad place to be, and I was very fortunate that I did get exposed to and understood, I became a valuing diversity instructor, and then I really saw what corporate racism was and sexism was, and I understood the glass ceiling, and I understood that, man, I mean, I'd go to a class and they said, why do they hire minorities when they could hire qualified or white people? Or why do they hire minorities when they could hire qualified people? So what you're really saying is white people are qualified, minorities are not. I beg to differ.
Definitely. My great-grandfather was a school teacher. His name was Florencio Manchego, and he would have been born like in the late 1800s. And maybe he didn't go to college. Somehow he became a teacher. But then his son, Tranquilino Manchego, he was in the first graduating class of Adams State University in 1925.
Wow! I saw that. That was too cool.
In the picture that that first class of Adams State, it used to be normal school, I think is what it used to be called. 1925, he is in there, and he was a teacher.
And you graduated from that same school.
Yeah, that was my undergrad. And then his son Orlando was a teacher, and so that teacher, if you were to run some kind of statistics as to how many teachers came from the valley, from the San Luis Valley, you'd be astounded. And so many of them went to Adams State University now. And then so many PhDs came out of there, Dr. Danielle Valdez, Zamora, he went to Notre Dame. I can't remember
Wow.
what his first name was. I mean, you'd be surprised at the PhDs that we could count that have come out of the valley.
In Alamosa?
You know,
In the San Luis Valley?
Adams State Valley, yeah. And
Wow.
whether they got, they got their doctorate elsewhere, but Adams State University was what kind of was the foundation for them, to go on. But yeah, the teachers. I had so many cousins that came to Denver, to teach, got their masters, and some even got my cousin Sammy Geico's got a PhD, and
Man.
I can, we can really talk about that. So we're not, we're an educated people, and to have that culture behind you and all that is even double good.
Rich. It's so rich. It's like a fertile field ready to plant, and just there's so much good that can come from it, and I'm just so excited.
I know, and the books we had, we never had people that looked like us in books. The first book, and this is said by so many people, the first book where we saw ourselves was Bless Mi Última para lo Anaya, with Antonio, the character. And it was wonderful. Oh my God, the first time I read it, I said, Antonio, and they're eating chili,
Wow, it looks like me.
Yeah, and this really can raise the self-esteem of children. If they see, people like them, whether you're black, Asian, whatever, if you see, people like you in books and in movies, it raises, your self-esteem.
Yes.
And for them to be trying right now to just get rid of these books, it's just horrible.
It's a shame. It's really a crime shame.
And it's fear.
It really is. It's fear and ignorance.
It's xenophobia. It really is. And they have to get. It would be such a much richer world if the acceptance, was there of everybody. It makes the diversity just makes everything so much more interesting and tasteful. I remember Rodolfo and I, when I met him, we went to dinner and he said, "Oh, where's the chili? Comida sin chile no es comida." You have to have that that flavor in everything you do.
Yeah, that's such a great analogy too, because I think that our lives are very colorful, and they're just like the beautiful colors that you see on a wall in Mexico. All of those colors are within us. I remember growing up hearing that America was a melting pot. And as I grew and I matured and I became more aware, I realized that it's nothing like a melting pot. Because a melting pot, everything becomes one, everything becomes the same. We're like a salad, and there's the lettuce, and there's the red onion, and there's the tomato, and the cucumber, and the croutons, and the dressing, and it all becomes one. And you know what? That's what makes it taste so good. And the sad thing is, if you take tomatoes out of the salad, it doesn't taste the same. And so we are not only contributors, but we're valuable contributors, and
yeah, when you talk about the color, I'm looking at all the Dia de los Muertos things that are out there. And in 2008, when I first went back to Pueblo as a librarian, and I was the Hispanic Resources Librarian in Special Collections, and I set up 3 really big displays of Dia de los Muertos, and people weren't used to that in Pueblo yet. And I got calls calling me a heathen.
Wow.
And all of a sudden, people or corporations started finding out how much money they can make from Dia de los Muertos. So now you see it everywhere. The only thing that I really worry about is that they lose the real meaning of Dia de los Muertos, which is, celebrating the death of our ancestors and the spirit. It's not a something more than that in the skulls, just making the skulls, but that those skulls have meaning, definition, and very spiritual. So I'm hoping that the Dia de los Muertos isn't totally taken by commercial, people making money off of it. They need to go back and find out the real meaning of Dia de los Muertos.
Yes.
And we're just about to celebrate it in a couple of days, 2 or 3 days.
Yeah, it's our favorite. It's our favorite holiday. We call this a holiday. Some people call it a pagan. I don't care. We put out our spider web in the front yard and our skeletons, and we put our pumpkins and our ghouls, and we do that part of it. But all my life, I never knew about the Dia de los Muertos part of it. The real
It's a Mexican
sacred
celebration
part.
in Mexico. It is.
remember the movie Coco came out, and when they really showed the essence of it and the beauty of it and how sacred it was, I even though it was a cartoon, I felt so much.
But we need movies like this that
more.
show the real history, the real culture, and what it really means.
Yes.
And so I'm really glad that we're getting, more movies like this. We need them. We need more, because really you don't see Chicanos, Hispanics in the
mainstream
movies still.
No.
You still don't. Commercials. I'm like,
we make 50% of the population in Los Angeles, and we're in 3% of the newscast. I mean, what does that say? That's I didn't mean to interrupt you, but yeah. One
of the things about moving to Denver with the news people, I am seeing more people of color, and I think it's wonderful. So I do have to give credit to the Denver stations that at this point in time they're realizing.
Yeah, more and more you're seeing more and more.
That inclusion.
Yeah, I'm so glad to see more people of color and women. I mean, I'm a feminist. I don't care what anyone says. I believe in a woman president. I've said it on the show many times before. I want a woman president because the men are just not doing it. The ego of men has destroyed this world, and I'm sorry, but that's the facts.
I really agree with you. We're used to juggling, just juggling so many things, and we think differently, So I really hope that in my lifetime I see a woman, a woman president.
Yeah, I am so hopeful, and maybe the next run, I think that it's a very likelihood that we will see a woman president. And right now, we're in the age of the divine feminine, and I'm getting off track, but I just want to say this real quick. And I've mentioned it on the show before, but if you think about it, the three most powerful people in the world, two are women. So you have the president, you have the vice president, and you have the Speaker of the House. I am glad to say that if our president were to die, we're in good hands. No, I'm not sorry. I feel strongly that the woman has more control, they're less temperamental, and I don't care what they say about being emotional. I think that's a powerful addition to who you are. Men who don't cry die young. And so I believe that it's just a time in this history that the divine feminine is about to take hold, and I'm very happy about that. A little off track, but just wanted to throw that.
No, I totally agree with you.
I sat down and read your book with a highlighter because I just saw so many things that I wanted to talk to you about. And I mean, right down from the Manito culture, I highlighted a few things, and there's one that I, in particular. But then it was as if there were no people living in the area mentioned above or history taking place until 1821 when the Santa Fe Trail opened for trade between western Missouri and Santa Fe. So, like I said, we just dropped onto the face of the earth.
Yeah, the three C's, Columbus, Cortez, Coronado, 1540, and from there until 1821 when the Santa Fe Trail opened up and people coming in from the east, and then with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, it was like, what is it, 200, 300 years of there was a lot happening in the Southwest with Hispanics, and again I say whatever we call ourselves, because your identity is personal, Chicano, Mexicano,
Spanish.
It's like we just dropped out of the face of the, and there was so much history happening.
Oh man!
During that time, so much history.
And all that time we were still contributing. You mentioned a book that was written about Latino Hispanic war heroes from the Revolutionary War to Afghanistan. We represent the highest number of medals of honor of all races.
Yeah, the government bookstore did a book on Hispanics in the military, and I don't know if it's still in print, but oh my God, you just couldn't believe how many there was,
and they're never listed in history books.
Yeah,
why?
And Prax Martinez from Costilla Garcia, that area, he wrote a book about all the men that went to war just within that little town. I mean, I bet there was 100, in the wars, and so this is something that's forgotten. We, our people have served their country.
Yep, absolutely.
Really.
Absolutely. I served proudly. I got my honorable discharge, and I'm proud to have served. And I think that's one thing that's a very big commonality, and we believe in our country. And when people tell us go back to where you come from, what a slap in the face.
I remember, I think it was Jose Calderon, he was a Chicano activist, and people on one side of a room were saying, go back to Mexico, and he stood up and said, we only crossed a river. You crossed an ocean. You go back to Europe or wherever
Yep.
wherever you came from.
Yep.
But there's so many sad things that that have been taken away from us. Like I said, our history. We need to teach our history, and
So much.
and they're trying to teach Chicano studies at K-12, and now they're running into problems. With one of the education institutions. Where they
Formalities there.
and it should be taught. It should be taught. Our kids need to feel pride and
Absolutely.
in themselves and in their history. They need to hear names like themselves. See
people who have brown hair and brown eyes, in positions of, I don't want to say power, because that's almost sound like a domination, but they need to be seen in positions of influence, in positions of finance, in positions of corporate management, in political power, because hey, we represent. I mean, we're here. We should be represented at all levels,
I know. I'm a librarian, and it's less than 5% of librarians in this country are of color.
Wow.
Hispanic, and of course, the statistics are even almost the same for blacks and less for indigenous people and Asians. But it was really neat because I taught at Bruce Randolph. I was actually the librarian, and it had a large population of Mexican children. And when they saw me, who was like them, it was just really, you could almost see that, we connected. Oh, hey, there's one of you here.
Yeah.
When there aren't many. If you go to a library, you want to see people of color, and you don't, and a lot of people need to go into that profession.
Yep.
They really do, and you need to see more people like yourself out in teaching and
Yes.
and all these other professions. You really do.
I remember when I used to go into the Denver public schools and do motivational speaking, and the kids would see me standing there and they thought I was a parent because, this Chicano guy doing motivational speaking, especially I was a ditch digger, I was a construction worker. Well, I put a suit and tie on and I went into the Lincoln High School. I taught there for like 5 or 6 semesters. But I taught a motivational class called Kickstart. And I tried to get the young people of color to look inside within and see the beauty that was there. I used to tell them, anyone can count the apples, the seeds in an apple, but nobody can count the apples in a seed. You are a seed, and I would always tell them about the greatness, and I talk about, there's wonderful things in you. What lies before you and what lies behind you are tiny matters when compared with what lies within you. I'm talking to you. Did you ever think you'd write a book?
I'm more into poetry, and so I
Your
don't
poems
know.
are wonderful.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I always thought I would write a book. I never thought I would publish one. I think there's a writer in all of us. But to let that book go is the scariest thing in the world.
Yeah.
It really is. Because it's like shooting an arrow. You can't get it back.
Yeah.
And so everybody I feel is a writer, and they write, but they don't it's hard to let it go.
Yep, it's so hard because you have these moments of embarrassment or times you got humiliated or.
But everybody's so afraid of criticism.
Oh man.
And you know what? I say, whatever.
I started writing a book back in the late '80s, and I was about 50 pages into the book, and I took it to a woman to look at it, and she read page 1 to the last page, and I was so disheartened because I did not take criticism. I saw that as criticism, and so it set me back 30 years in my writing, and now I'm starting to write some poetry. I'm not writing a book right now, but it's a thing that it's called consistency. And it's just making a decision. Guys, before I forget, I want to make sure and just let you know, thank you for joining us. You're watching KUHS The Stream on Melody Drive, and this is the Weekend Boost. I am your host, Paul Lane, and we are talking to Charlene Garcia Sims, and regarding her book, The Orphan Stock, Growing Up Adopted in Manito Culture. And for those of you who don't know what Manito culture is, give us a little refreshing. What is Manito culture?
A Manito is someone whose ancestors arrived in New Mexico in 1598 with Oñate, who colonized, let's say what it is, they colonized New Mexico,
Mhm.
and then they were pushed back by, actually, the only successful Pueblo revolt. They were pushed back by the Pueblo Indians in 1680. And there's actually a Star Trek, one of the Star Trek stories where Captain Picard is trying to not have this happen, but it happens anyway.
Wow.
But then they came back, and the Spanish came back in 1692 with Diego de Vargas. So it's that culture that was there from 1598 to the present, practically.
Mhm.
I still have nieces and nephews that live in Antonito, in the valley, and they still speak that Castilian
Wow.
language.
Yeah.
So it's people whose ancestors arrived in New Mexico in 1598, and then survived the 1680 revolt, and they came back. It's that 300-year
Span.
yeah, and there may have been some goods going back and forth to Chihuahua, but most of the little villages were really much isolated.
Very isolated.
Yeah, and like I said, the Castilian language, and I also say that you will know the difference between a manito and someone maybe from Mexico that came later in the bread pudding. We call it sopa, and they call it capirotada. The people from Mexico call it. My husband was from that other from his ancestor came later from Mexico. But if you ask somebody, what do you call bread pudding? If they say sopa, they're from the San Luis Valley, from that manito culture.
Yeah, your book talks about the word carro.
Yeah, if they say capirotada, then it's the people
It's
that came later, like in the late 1800s and early 1900s, escaping the Mexican Revolution.
Wow.
Because we do have those two cultures. They're different, and they've meshed. A lot of them have meshed, but it's complicated. It's so complicated.
Yes, yes.
It really is. It's very complicated.
It's so fascinating. Victor Villaseñor in his book Reign of Gold talks about this man who was Greek and Turkish. And Greeks and Turks don't like each other, and the blood within him would boil, and it would fight within him. And so many times when we're at this a crux in our life, when we're confused and we're conflicted and we don't know what it is, I believe it's that blood within us that's bumping into itself and saying, you know what, you need to be a conqueror. No, you need to be a contributor. No, you want to be a Chicano. No, I'm Spanish. And so that blood is
and this is what I love about I Am Joaquin, that it brings this out that we are both the victor and the vanquished. And so we're fighting ourselves.
Wow.
And I don't like what the Spanish did, but I still have that Spanish blood, and I still have a lot of those traditions that I grew up with, and I'm very, very proud of.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's been one thing that's really been a big, I don't want to say step, but a big revelation to me was understanding that, I used to, I ain't gonna lie to you, I used to be, when I would hear someone say, I'm Spanish, I would say, you're ignorant, but the fact of the matter is I'm Spanish, and for the longest time I just resisted it because I was so angry to the Spaniards because of, King Philip and what they did with Isabella, and how they sanctioned the slavery, and those were my grandparents, and so that conquest rage boiled up in me, and I understood it now, and now I can harness it and I can use it for good, and so
I think so too. I really do. Once the conquistadores were gone, the people, the peasant, that my ancestors stayed and worked so hard, on the land. New Mexico was not easy to live in. You had locusts that came and ate their crops, and I mean they suffered. These were my ancestors, and we can't change history. Every part has the conquistadores. They were but the people that remained, were such good people, hard working. I instill in my children, their grandparents and great grandparents' work ethic.
yes.
These people work from sun up to sundown. My grandpa used to get up in the morning and go out and
You would plow the fields at 2 a.m. sometimes.
In fact, he used, after he stopped being a teacher, that's what he did. He would go out at 2 a.m. because that was the best time to water. And
wow.
Yeah, and I remember one day he says that he was walking back home, in the darkness, and he felt something behind him, and and he turned and he saw a woman dressed in white.
Mm-hmm.
So he hurried out to the house, and when he turned back again, when he got to the house, he didn't see anybody. So, because she was weeping, so he pretty much thinks that she was La Llorona.
That's another great thing about our culture is La Llorona. No other culture has La Llorona. We are, we have our own monster, our own Llorona. I remember growing up and hearing stories of it, and I remember going camping one time, and Abe was the camp leader, the scout leader, and he was a black guy, and it was real dark night, and he says, "I'm going to tell you a story," and he smoked a pipe, and it was real dark, and he could see the smoke coming out, and he said, "We're going to talk about La Llorona." I said, "What?" Llorona. We had to go back and forth a few times before we understood he was talking about La Llorona. And all my life, since early childhood, I remember the story of La Llorona.
Yeah, that's our boogeyman and their boogie woman, and the Germans had Lorelei, who didn't like men after she was heartbroken, and she would call him over, and they would, vanish, or so everybody has kind of their own little Llorona, but this is ours. Ours is La Llorona.
Yes.
From Mexico to here.
To here, and it survived, and I don't know if the story has transformed. I was reading your son's book, and by the way, I want him on this show. This is another great book, the Red Moon Night, and it talks about why they call it the Red Book. I mean, why is this book titled that? This young man kept having experiences with the full moon that was blood red. I love this book too, by the way. So we'll be talking about that in shows to come. I definitely would like to host your son here. There's just, from every single page you go to, I highlighted 1848. Wait, get my glasses here. And I've highlighted a few points that I wanted to talk about. This area had been part of Mexico until 1848, when the Mexican-American War ended, and Mexico ceded the southwest states to the United States. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed February 2nd, 1848, gave people who had been Mexican citizens United States citizenship if they chose to stay. Now, I read that, and I went back in my mind to my great-great-grandparents or great-great-great-grandparents who woke up one morning and it was no longer Mexico in southern Colorado, and how lost they must have been, because no longer were they Mexican, but they were not American either. Even though they were American, the Americans, people said, "Oh, you do it." It's kind of like when I grew up, I had a white last name in a Chicano school, and I couldn't get in with the Chicano kids. I couldn't get in with the white kids, and so I stuck with the drug addicts. No, but it was like, what a lonely place to be.
And it was 1,000 miles away from Mexico, so they had never really been governed. They had to self-govern themselves really when they were here. And so when the treaty was signed, Spain had forgotten them. Mexico had its own problems. They didn't really want them. And the United States definitely, even though they made promises, they were, so many racist things happened, and they didn't want them. So, but these people didn't know any better. This was their home.
Yes.
Why would they go to Mexico, a country they did not know?
Yeah.
And a few went, and I can't remember the number, maybe 1,000, and they went. And then it's really funny because then the United States decided, oh no, we want that area too where the Gadsden Purchase was. This is where a lot of them went. But no, the United States says, oh no, we want that too. That's good railroad property. So they went and purchased it. So here are these people that had said, okay, I don't want to stay here. I want to go to Mexico. Now they have the Gadsden Purchase, and these people, there should be a study of where those people went.
Wow.
I talked to Dr. Sandoval, who was a professor at the University in Pueblo, and he said that there was some research being done as to what happened to those.
Wow.
It was 1,000 people. Can you imagine? Okay, you say, I don't want to stay here. I'm going to go to Mexico, and then they say, oh, and then a few years later they go, oh no, we need that.
You got to move here again.
Yeah, and where did they go? I don't know where those were, but those people that stayed, this was their home. They couldn't just pack up and go to Mexico, so they stayed, and they became. David Weber, this wonderful historian, calls them citizens by default.
Wow.
And then they were disenfranchised. Their land was taken, so now they went from landowners to wage. They had to make a wage.
Because they didn't speak English, and Virginia Sanchez talks about the book, and they didn't speak English, and they wouldn't translate it, and they brought in their litigators who didn't speak Spanish, and they woke up and they said, this land is not your land anymore. So when I sing the song, this land is your land, this land is my land, it's not true.
Yeah, and so I always wondered why Colorado's a square. Why did we lose that little area that used to be New Mexico, and Virginia Sanchez explains it because they
So beautiful.
they needed 7,000 more people to be able to make Colorado a state. But Virginia explains it much more beautifully, and so you had, you know, Cosilla and Garcia, where I grew up in Garcia. Cosilla's, you have one foot in Colorado, one foot in New Mexico. But when that happened, when Colorado, the border was made, one set of grandparents remained in New Mexico, and one set of grandparents remained in Colorado, and there was never a border for us. There was never. We just went back and forth, never a Colorado New Mexico border. You know, and I always wondered, why did that happen? And Virginia Sanchez explains it in pleas and petitions as to why this happened.
Have you ever heard of Ocate, New Mexico?
Oh yes.
My suegros were from there, and there's some Manchegos in there, and that's why I asked that. And Juan Manchego was the first.
Yeah, that Manchego is in our line, probably back 5 generations.
Wow,
we have to go back. But yeah, one of my best friends is from Ocate in that area. So I visited Ocate not too long ago, right before the fires. You know, I don't know what.
Angel Fire, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what but yeah, we came through Angel Fire down into that Ocate area.
And Ocate is just like San Acacio. It's a village. It's really not a town. It's officially not anything except there's a post office there, and you know, there's not much else. But it's so interesting because I think through history, if you look, our family's somewhere connected, you know. Yeah. And so it's interesting.
But those little villages were strong at one time, whether it was because working for the railroad or working for the mines, and now they're very much ghost towns.
Through many unscrupulous acts, the Bonitos lost their land and had to turn to wage labor. What a shame that it was taken from us, and we were really forced into exile in our own land, you know?
Yeah, there's a group that was called the Santa Fe Ring, and they, well, we didn't know the law. Spanish land law was so different from American land law.
Oh, yeah.
And our people didn't know the new law, so they, you know, through many unscrupulous acts, they lost it.
Yeah, you know, and Virginia talks about how landowners would come and cattlemen would come, usually from Texas, and they'd move their fence posts further and further onto the land that was not theirs, and then they just claimed it. And it was that simple. That's exactly what they did. They literally stole the land.
And they
from
brought
us.
barbed wire.
And that barbed wire was something high tech at that time. Yeah, there was no crossing it really. I mean, it was get yourself ripped up.
There's so much history, and I taught Chicano studies for 6 years at the University in Pueblo, and I had many Chicanos and non-Chicanos, and the social work program required that they take Chicano studies. So at the end of the class, they would come and thank me for having taught them this because it had been taught. Non-Chicanos came up and taught me, and especially blacks. They said, we didn't know that you had gone through so much of what we went through. So without teaching this history, it robs us of the truth.
Yes,
of
it
true
really does.
American
Identity.
history. True American history and identity.
Yes,
so
and that's really, I'm sorry, history, American history. And, you know, and it's like when you look at American history, there's never a brown face in it. And it just never ceases to amaze me that we've been such contributors, and yet we've never had a place at the table. And, you know, I know I sound angry, but...
It's time.
Yeah, it's time. It's time that we scoot over. You know, if we can, we'll pull up a chair, dang it.
And things are getting a little better with, well, Chicano studies, if we just get a strong Chicano studies programs and teaching from K through 12. I wish educators at that high level would understand the importance to our children.
Yeah, and instead they're taking history off. You know, I have a theory about that, how, you know, they don't want history taught, they want it all wiped out. And you know what, I believe that it's really dangerous because history repeats itself. And if we don't know our history, when it repeats itself, we're never going to see it coming. And so we must be aware. We must open the eyes of our friends and neighbors and relatives, because if we don't, we're going to be on the receiving end of a slavery conviction. And that's my opinion, and I feel like I'm very valid in it.
History is really important.
It's truly important.
But you have to have a complete history. You have to tell the history of everybody that was here.
The complete history.
Not just the dominant, you know, you really need to teach the true history.
You know, I got to share with you, I was probably in my 30s when I first discovered the book Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by Dee Brown. And I stumbled upon this book, and I was an avid reader, and I read it, and I bawled, I cried and cried for my, you know, for the horrors of my indigenous brothers and sisters, of my grandfathers and grandmothers who went through so much cruelty. And that's not a, you know, when they're not being taught in schools, that's not a complete history.
And look what's been done to the indigenous populations, you know.
And continues to be done.
And who's paying attention to them, you know, with
Mhm.
COVID in Gallup, New Mexico, the things that, you know, they were asking them to wash their hands all the time. Well, how could they wash their hands when they had no water?
Yeah, oh yeah.
You know, the irony,
Mhm.
telling them, yeah, you know, if you won't get COVID if you wash it well. You need the water
Yep.
on these reservations.
40% of native homes don't have running water or toilets in them.
And is there any understanding in Washington? I don't think so.
No. Oh, no, you know what most people mainstream think? They think that they have, you know, $5,000 a month coming in and they have these mansions they live in, and it's not so.
Oh, especially with the casinos. They think that they're the, now
Mm.
who's making the money off the casinos? The gamer, you know, the people that build the gaming machines and so on and so forth. So there's some real misconceptions there.
Yep, and it needs to be known. It needs to be, you know, exposed, because it's really a con. It's really a con, and you know, man, this hour has gone so fast. We didn't get to talk about the people of El Valle. We haven't talked about your son's book. Is that the right time? I can't believe this.
What time is it?
It's we got about 3 minutes left.
Oh my goodness, it's been so fascinating. I loved it.
There is so much. I mean, there's so much. I want to talk about Anita Ortiz Cordova, the one that everybody in the Valle was taught by.
50 years. She
Yeah.
taught 50 years, and she would have chaos in her kindergarten through fourth grade room, but she would take each child, even with all, and teach them to read. My brother learned how to read from her. So many people learned to read from her.
Wow. And there's many people alive today that read because she taught them.
She took the time. She took the time, the individual time, to teach them to read.
I read the story of the cornfield, and you know, there's just so many things that I want to talk about. Your poetry, I love your poetry.
Oh,
there's
thank
so many
you.
things. Would you read a poem from the book?
Sure.
We got a couple minutes
You
left.
want me to do the I will not speak in Spanish?
Yes,
or? Okay.
yes. And I had, I don't know, maybe you can find it faster than I can.
Let's see.
Guys, while she's finding that, you are watching KUHS The
Okay.
Stream on Melody Drive.
Right.
This is the Weekend Boost. This is Charlene Garcia.
As I said, our Spanish was taken away from us. Luckily, I was left behind with my grandparents. Okay. I will not speak in Spanish. I will not speak in Spanish. I will not speak in Spanish. I'm getting tired of staying after school and writing I will not speak in Spanish over and over on the blackboard. Won't I ever learn? Today we ran out of blackboard space and Mrs. Roybal had us write it on paper 100 times. Won't we ever learn? But it's better than last year when Sister Veronica would have us open our hands and she would hit the palm twice with that ugly, splintered wooden ruler of hers. I didn't have to stay after school today, neither did my best friend Irene nor my cousin Tommy. Each day fewer and fewer of us are staying except for Billy, who refuses to listen, but I think it's because he can't read nor write. They call him dumb. Billy hasn't been to school for a month now. We think he dropped out. We have 2 new students, a brother and sister from Chamita. Today they have to stay after school to write on the blackboard. But soon, they won't have to stay because like the rest of us, they too will learn. I will not speak in Spanish. I will not speak in Spanish. I will not speak in Spanish.
That just brings a lump to my throat because there's so much shame that was instilled in us as youngsters, and you know, we were taught to be ashamed of our race, but you've brought this to the light. And guys, I always say it on my show every week. I live by this, and it's this: if you can't find a hero, be a hero. I'm looking at a hero.
Thank you.
Charlene, I mean,
love my culture. I love spreading it and, you know, doing what
Yes.
I do.
This book needs to be in your hands, guys. You need to get this book. You need to own this book. It's revelatory. It's enlightening. It's entertaining. It's easy read, and it's worth the read, guys. Where can someone get your book?
Right now, I'm going to give my email, charlenegarcia161@gmail.com. You can also look for it in Vanishing Horizons. It's a publishing company out of Pueblo. So Vanishing Horizons, just type it in. Vanishing Horizons, Pueblo, Colorado.
This has been probably the fastest hour I've ever had in the show. I have enjoyed talking to you so much.
Oh, well,
Yeah,
thank
I mean,
you.
it's
I've enjoyed
just,
being here. I
thank
love
you.
spreading the word.
All right. Well, guys, our show is about wrapped up for now, for today, and We've got another show coming up in 2 weeks. I promise you it's going to be good, entertaining, informative information. Join us. You've been watching KUHS, the stream on Melody Drive. This is the Weekend Boost. You've been watching Paul Lane, your host, and Charlene Garcia, a hero. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
See you guys next week. Have a great